What if the wedding you are planning, or the one you just attended, is a pale shadow of what it used to be? Today, a wedding can feel like a performance, a carefully curated event for social media. The average cost in the United States hovers around $30,000. That is more than many people make in a year. We worry about the dress, the venue, the guest list, the photographer. But have we lost something? Have we traded deep, meaningful community rituals for a one-day spectacle? The medieval period gets a bad rap. We think of it as dark, brutal, and simple. But when it came to marriage, it was anything but. Their traditions were woven into the fabric of everyday life. They were about community, law, family, and survival. They were practical. But they were also deeply symbolic. And many of them were incredibly romantic in a way that feels raw and real, not staged and filtered. These were not just forgotten traditions. They were promises made visible. They were rituals that bound not just two people, but entire villages. So, what did they do that we have forgotten? Did they really have trial marriages? Why was the most important part of the wedding held outside the church door? And what was the intimate gift a husband gave his wife the morning after their wedding to prove the marriage was real? Let's look back at the rituals we left behind. We might find that what we think of as ancient and strange is actually more meaningful than what we do today. Number 20. Why did a wedding depend on a pot of beer? Imagine a wedding without a gift registry. No blenders, no towels, no request for cash. Instead, your friends and neighbors all chip in to launch your new life together. That was the idea behind the bride ale. It sounds like a simple party, but it was much more than that. Okay? It was a cornerstone of community life and one of the most practical and supportive wedding traditions imaginable. The ale and bride ale was literal. A special, strong batch of ale was brewed just for the occasion. The bride, or sometimes her family, would be the one to brew it. This wasn't just any beer. It was a celebratory brew, often better and more potent than the daily stuff. The event itself was a feast, a party held for the new couple. But here's the crucial part. Their guests paid for their ale. They bought their drinks and their food, and all the money, every last penny of the profit, went directly to the newlyweds to help them set up their household. It was a fundraiser disguised as the best party of the year. This was not a fringe custom. It was common across England and parts of Europe, especially from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Historian and food writer Francine Pross touches upon the social importance of ale in this period. This ale wasn't just a drink, it was nutrition, a social lubricant, and a part of daily wages. A wedding ale, therefore, was a significant community event. The quality of the ale reflected on the bride's skill and the family's standing. Records from local parishes often mention these events. For instance, churchwarden accounts from places like St. Lawrence's Parish in Reading, England, dating back to the 1500s, show records of church ales and bride ales, indicating they were recognized and sometimes even sponsored by the local church as a way to raise funds for the community or for a specific couple. Think about the romance in that. It is not the romance of a candlelit dinner. It is the romance of a community saying, "We believe in you. We are invested in your success." Your marriage was not a private affair. It was a public good. The entire village had a stake in your new family thriving. They showed it not by buying you a toaster you might never use, but by gathering, celebrating, and giving you the cold, hard cash you needed to buy a pot, fix a roof, or purchase a cow. It was a vote of confidence paid for in mugs of beer. The bride ale was a beautiful, practical expression of social solidarity. It was crowdfunding before the internet was even a dream. The tradition eventually faded. The Protestant Reformation brought a new sense of sobriety and a suspicion of rowdy celebrations. Puritans, in particular, frowned upon these events, viewing them as disorderly and an excuse for drunkenness. Laws were passed to curb them. As society became more mobile and less centered on the small village, the deep-knit community support system that made the bride ale possible began to unravel. We replaced it with more individualistic traditions. The idea of asking your wedding guests to pay for their drinks now seems tacky. But we have just replaced it with wishing wells and honeymoon funds, a less direct, perhaps less honest, version of the same idea. So as we look at our modern, expensive weddings, we have to ask some questions about what we have lost. Did the decline of the bride ale signal a shift from community responsibility to individual burden for new couples? How much social pressure was on a bride to brew a good ale? And what happened if it was terrible? And in a world where we are more digitally connected but socially isolated than ever, could we ever bring back a tradition that required an entire village to show up and say, "Your future is our future." Number 19 was the wedding procession, a parade or a ransom. A bride walking down the aisle is a classic image. It is a quiet, solemn moment. The medieval wedding procession was the opposite. It was loud, boisterous, and it took over the entire village. It was a public spectacle, a moving party that snaked its way from the bride's home to the church. And it was not always a smooth journey. The procession was a critical part of the wedding day. It was the visual announcement to the world that a union was being formed. The bride would be dressed in her finest clothes, which, contrary to popular belief, were not usually white. She wore her best dress, whatever color it happened to be. Blue was a popular color associated with purity and the Virgin Mary. She would be flanked by her family and friends, and often led by musicians playing pipes, fiddles, and drums. The groom would have his own party, and sometimes they would meet along the way or at the church door. This was not a quiet affair. People would shout, sing, and cheer. It was a declaration. This public display was legally important. In an age with limited paperwork, having witnesses was everything. As the couple walked through the village, everyone who saw them became a witness to their intention to marry. This is a concept explored by social historian Georges Duby in his work on medieval marriage. He emphasizes that marriage was a long process, not a single event, and public recognition was a key stage. The procession was a physical manifestation of that recognition. It made the marriage real in the eyes of the community long before a priest said a word. But here is where it gets interesting. The procession often had to overcome obstacles. Literally. It was a tradition in many parts of Europe for the villagers to block the path of the wedding party. They would tie ropes or ribbons across the road. To pass, the groom or the bride's father would have to pay a small toll. This was not a hostile act, it was a playful bit of community theater. The toll might be a few coins or a drink from a flask of wine. It was a symbolic ransom for the bride, a final, fun acknowledgement that she was leaving one community, her family, and joining another. It was a way for everyone to participate in the day's events. The romance here is in the spectacle and the shared joy. Imagine your entire town stopping to celebrate you, not just the people you invited, but everyone. The procession turned the personal act of getting married into a public festival. The playful tolls were a reminder that marriage changes social dynamics, but in a way that everyone could celebrate together. It reinforced the idea that a marriage did not just happen in a vacuum. It was a rearranging of the entire social landscape, and everyone got to have a little fun with it. This tradition of a public, noisy procession slowly died out. As towns grew into cities, it became impractical to shut down a street for a wedding party. The rise of church-controlled, indoor ceremonies also moved the focus away from the community procession and onto the sacred rite. The solemn, quiet walk down the aisle replaced the raucous village parade. We gained reverence, perhaps, but we lost the spontaneous, joyful participation of the entire neighborhood. This leaves us with some curious thoughts. How often did these playful tolls turn into genuine attempts to extort money from a wealthy groom's family? Were there designated toll points in a village? Or could anyone with a rope just try their luck? And what does it say about our modern weddings that the procession is now often just a short walk from a limousine to the church door, seen only by the invited guests? Have we privatized a joy that was meant to be public? Number 18, why was crying at a wedding a good thing? Today, tears at a wedding are usually seen as a sign of overwhelming happiness. Maybe a parent gets emotional, or the couple themselves tear up while saying their vows. But in the medieval period, the bride's tears were not just expected, they were encouraged. A crying bride was considered good luck. This tradition, known as crying the bride, was particularly strong in certain cultures. It stemmed from a mix of practical and superstitious beliefs. On a practical level, a wedding was a major life upheaval for a young woman. She was often leaving the only home she had ever known. She was moving in with her new husband and his family, a group of relative strangers. Her entire world was about to change. Crying was a natural and healthy expression of her grief for the life she was leaving behind and her anxiety about the future. It was a recognized rite of passage, but the superstitious element was even more powerful. It was widely believed that a bride's tears on her wedding day would save her from crying later in her marriage. The idea was that she could use up all her allotted sorrow on that one day, ensuring a future filled with happiness. It was a kind of emotional prepayment against future marital strife. Folklorists like Alan Dundes have studied similar traditions across many cultures, where ritualized weeping serves to ward off evil or ensure good fortune. A tearful wedding was seen as a well-defended one. If the bride did not cry, it was considered bad luck, a sign that she was perhaps too eager to leave her family, or, worse, that she was bottling up tears that would inevitably spill out during her marriage. The romance in this is subtle and deeply empathetic. It is a tradition that acknowledges the complexity of marriage. It recognizes that even a happy event can be tinged with sadness and fear. It made space for the bride's feelings. Instead of telling her to smile and be happy, it gave her permission to be vulnerable. It was a way for the community to say, we see that this is hard, and we honor your feelings. In a society where women often had little say in their marriage arrangements, this tradition gave them a sanctioned emotional outlet. It validated their experience in a way that feels surprisingly modern and psychologically astute. The practice of encouraging bridal tears faded as our ideas about marriage changed. With the rise of the love match as the ideal, the focus shifted entirely to joy and romance. And marriage was no longer framed as a potentially difficult transition, but as the happy culmination of a love story. A crying bride was no longer seen as lucky, but as perhaps having second thoughts. We replaced a tradition that acknowledged complexity with one that demands simple, uncomplicated happiness, at least on the surface. We expect a beaming bride, not a weeping one. This forgotten custom raises some poignant questions. How many medieval brides felt pressured to cry, even if they were not sad, just to ensure good luck? Did this tradition actually help women process the transition to married life, acting as a form of catharsis? And in our modern obsession with the perfect, happy wedding day, have we made it harder for people to be honest about the very real anxieties and sadness that can come with even the most joyful life changes? Number 17. Did a piece of cake seal the deal? The wedding cake is now a centerpiece, a multi-tiered work of art. We cut it, we feed it to each other, we save a piece for our first anniversary. But its origins are far messier and more direct. The medieval precursor to the wedding cake was not so much eaten as it was experienced. And it often involved breaking it over the bride's head. This tradition goes back to ancient Rome with a practice called conferatio, where a barley cake was broken over the bride's head to symbolize her fertility and the groom's dominance. This custom evolved throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. In England, small, spiced buns or scones were a common feature at weddings. These were not stacked into a grand cake. Instead, they were piled high on a platter. The bride and groom would have to try to kiss over the top of the pile without knocking it over. If they succeeded, it was a sign that they would have a prosperous life together. But the more direct tradition was the breaking of the bread or cake. After the church ceremony, a piece of bread or a small cake would be broken directly over the bride's head. This was a powerful symbol of fertility and good fortune. The crumbs that fell were eagerly scooped up by the guests. Eating a crumb from the wedding cake was thought to bring good luck and, for an unmarried guest, a chance at finding a spouse soon. It was a way for the community to share in the couple's good fortune. The historical context for this lies in the immense importance of fertility. In a world with high infant mortality, and where a family's wealth and labor depended on having children, fertility was not just a personal desire, it was a community-wide concern. As historian Christopher Brooke notes in his book The Medieval Idea of Marriage, ensuring the continuation of the family line was a primary purpose of marriage. The breaking of the grain-based cake over the bride was a potent, almost magical, ritual to invoke this blessing. The grain itself was a symbol of life, harvest, and abundance. Showering the bride with it was a direct prayer for her to be fruitful. The romance here is primal. It is the romance of life, legacy, and hope. It is a raw, earthy tradition that connects the couple directly to the cycles of nature and the fundamental human desire to create a family. It is less about refined sentiment and more about the powerful, shared hope for the future. The community's act of gathering the crumbs shows, once again, how invested everyone was in the success of the marriage. Your fertility was their future too. This messy tradition evolved over time. According to a legend, sometime in the 17th century, a French chef visiting London saw the unwieldy pile of buns and had the idea to frost them together, creating the ancestor of the modern tiered wedding cake. The practice of breaking the cake over the bride's head understandably fell out of favor as it was replaced by the more dignified act of cutting the cake together. we still have a remnant of the sharing of luck in the tradition of giving guests a piece of cake to take home. But the raw, direct symbolism has been lost. It leaves us wondering about the bride's perspective. How did a medieval bride feel knowing a cake was about to be crumbled over her carefully arranged hair and her best dress? Was there a specific type of cake used, one that crumbled easily without being too greasy? And does the pristine, untouched perfection of our modern wedding cakes symbolize a shift away from embracing the messy, unpredictable, and fertile reality of life itself? Number 16. What did flowers on your head really mean? Today, a bride might wear a veil, a tiara, or a simple clip in her hair. In the Middle Ages, the most common headwear for a bride was a flower garland. This was not just a pretty accessory, it was a powerful symbol, a crown that spoke volumes about her status and her virtue. The bride's garland, often called a chaplet, was typically made of fresh flowers and herbs. While the choice of plants was not random, each had its own meaning. Rosemary was a favorite, symbolizing love, loyalty, and remembrance. Myrtle was another common choice, an ancient symbol of Venus, the goddess of love. The flowers were woven into a circle, a shape with no beginning and no end, representing eternity. This crown was the bride's most important adornment, more so than her dress. It was her wedding crown. This tradition was widespread across Europe. In art and literature from the period, brides are almost always depicted with a floral chaplet. Let's think of Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet, who, in her madness, hands out flowers with specific meanings. This deep understanding of the language of flowers was part of everyday life. For a bride to wear a garland of rosemary and roses was a public declaration of her love and fidelity. But the garland had another, even more crucial meaning. It was a symbol of her maidenhood. Only a virgin bride was permitted to wear the flower crown. It was a visible badge of her purity. If a bride was not a virgin, or if she was a widow remarrying, she could not wear the garland. The significance of this is explored in historical studies of women's lives, such as The Ties That Bound Peasant Families in Medieval England by Barbara Hannawalt. She details how a woman's reputation was her most valuable asset. The flower garland was the ultimate public statement of that reputation. To wear it was to be celebrated as a pure and honorable bride. For a groom, it was a source of pride. The garland was so important that if a young, unmarried woman died, she was often buried wearing a floral chaplet, as if she were a bride of Christ. The romance of the flower garland is one of sincerity and natural beauty. It connects the bride to the natural world and its cycles of life and growth. It is a tradition that values simplicity and meaning over expense and ostentation. A crown of fresh flowers, chosen for their symbolism, feels more personal and heartfelt than a diamond tiara. It is a testament to love that is fresh, alive, and rooted in the earth. It also honored the bride, crowning her as the queen of the day. The tradition of the bride's garland began to fade in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The veil, which had been worn by women for centuries but not always by brides, began to gain popularity. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century pushed for more standardized Catholic wedding rites, and the veil, with its symbolism of modesty and submission, fit well with the Church's patriarchal message. As fashion became more elaborate, the simple flower crown was replaced by more complex headdresses, jewels, and eventually the white wedding veil we know today. This lost tradition makes you think, how much pressure did the virginity test of the garland put on young women in a society with no reliable contraception? Was a woman ever publicly shamed or denied a garland at the last minute based on village gossip? And as we see a modern resurgence in flower crowns at festivals and weddings, are we unconsciously tapping into this ancient desire for natural, meaningful symbols, or is it just a fleeting fashion trend, stripped of its original, potent meaning? Number 15. What gift proved the marriage was real? Imagine waking up the morning after your wedding. The party is over. Your life has changed. And your new husband gives you a gift. This was not just a sweet gesture, it was a legally significant and deeply personal tradition known as the morning gift, or morgengabe in Germanic law. The morning gift was a provision of property, land, or money made by the husband to his wife on the morning after the marriage was consummated. This was a crucial point. The gift was a reward for her virginity and a confirmation that the marriage was now physically, as well as legally, complete. But it was more than just a payment. The property or money gifted to her became her own personal property. She could control it, manage it, and it would provide for her if her husband died. It was a form of life insurance and a source of personal power and autonomy. This tradition has ancient roots, predating church-controlled marriage. It is mentioned by the Roman historian Tacitus in his first-century work Germania, where he describes the customs of the Germanic tribes. He notes that the groom provides a gift to the bride, not the other way around. This practice was formalized in early medieval law codes across Europe. For example, the 7th century laws of Aethelbald of Kent, one of the earliest legal texts in Old English, specifies the details of the mourning gift. It was a serious binding contract, often included in the marriage settlement negotiated between the two families. The size of the gift reflected the groom's wealth and the bride's social standing. For a queen, it could be a third of a kingdom. For a peasant, it might be a cow or a small plot of land. The romance of the mourning gift is in its intimacy and its respect for the wife. It was a private transaction between husband and wife, a quiet moment of recognition after the very public spectacle of the wedding day. It was the husband's first act of providing for his new wife. It was a tangible promise to care for her. In a world where women's property rights were often precarious, the mourning gift gave a wife a measure of financial independence. It was a gift that said, "You are now my wife, and I value you. You are secure." This practical care is a profound form of love. The mourning gift tradition began to decline in the later Middle Ages, although it persisted in some parts of Europe for centuries. It was gradually replaced by other legal concepts like dower. Dower was a wife's legal right to a portion, usually 1/3 of her husband's estate upon his death. While dower provided security for widows, it was less personal than the mourning gift. It was a legal default, not a specific personal gift given at the dawn of a marriage. The focus shifted from a gift confirming consummation to a legal right activated by death. The loss of this tradition makes us consider the financial and emotional dynamics of marriage. What was the average value of a mourning gift for a common farmer, not a nobleman? We have records for the rich, but the daily lives of the poor are often lost to history. Did a wife ever refuse the gift if she was unhappy with the wedding night or the marriage itself? And in an era of prenuptial agreements and joint bank accounts, is there a modern equivalent to a gift that both confirms the intimacy of marriage and guarantees a woman's financial autonomy within it? Number 14, why did they toss the garter? The garter toss is a wedding tradition that many people today find a bit awkward. The groom removes a piece of his bride's lingerie and throws it to a crowd of his single male friends. Its medieval origins, however, are even more wild and chaotic. It was not so much a toss as a frantic grab. In the Middle Ages, the bride's garter was considered a piece of good luck. It was an intimate item of clothing that was believed to be imbued with the good fortune and fertility of the wedding day. Guests, particularly the young men, were desperate to get a piece of it. This led to a rather unruly situation where, at the end of the wedding feast, male guests would rush the bride and try to tear the garter right off her leg. One can imagine this being terrifying and dangerous for the bride. This chaotic scramble is documented in various historical accounts of medieval life. It was part of a larger belief in the power of wedding-related objects. Just like guests grabbed for crumbs of the wedding cake, they also sought pieces of the bride's clothing. To protect the bride from being mobbed, the tradition evolved. The bride and groom would retreat to the bridal chamber, and as a way to appease the rowdy crowd outside, the groom would remove the garter and toss it out the door or window to them. This was the birth of the garter toss we know today. It was an act of crowd control. The symbolism goes deeper than just good luck. In her book, The Wedding Complex Forms of Belonging in Modern American Culture, historian Elizabeth Freeman discusses how wedding rituals often involve the symbolic transfer of the bride. The garter grab was a literal, physical manifestation of the community's claim on the bride's fertility. It was also a not-so-subtle piece of evidence. The removal of the garter was a precursor to the consummation of the marriage. The men who caught it were not just catching luck. They were catching a symbol that the marriage was about to be officially and physically sealed. The romance here is admittedly a bit rough around the edges. It is not gentle or sweet. But it is a romance of robust, earthy celebration. It speaks to a time when life was lived more publicly and with fewer inhibitions. The garter grab in all its chaos shows a community so overjoyed and invested in a marriage that they literally wanted to tear off a piece of the celebration to take with them. It was a wild communal cheer for the couple's future fertility and happiness. The tradition was tamed over centuries. The mad dash for the garter was replaced by the more orderly, if still slightly strange, toss. It became a ritualized game rather than a drunken riot. The connection to consummation also became less explicit as society grew more private about the wedding night. Today, many couples skip the tradition altogether, finding it outdated or sexist. We have preserved the form but lost the original chaotic meaning. This raucous history leaves some intriguing questions. How many brides were actually injured during these garter scrambles? Were there rules of engagement, or was it a complete free-for-all? And does our modern discomfort with the garter toss show that we have become more prudish, or simply more respectful of the bride's personal space and dignity? Number 13, what did your girdle say about you? Long before wedding rings became the standard, another accessory was a powerful symbol of a woman's marital status, the girdle. A girdle in the medieval sense was not a piece of restrictive underwear. It was a belt, often made of fabric, leather, or even woven metal, worn around the waist or hips over a woman's dress. And it was rich with meaning. For an unmarried woman, a girdle was a symbol of her virginity and chastity. The phrase ungirdled was a euphemism for a woman who was sexually available or loose. A maiden wore her girdle as a sign of her protected status. During the wedding ceremony, a key moment was the girding of the bride. The groom would either tie a new girdle around his bride's waist, or, in some traditions, he would untie the one she was wearing. This act symbolized her transition from a maiden to a married woman. It was a public and symbolic representation of the groom's new access to her body. And girdles were also practical items. Women would hang keys, a purse, or a small knife from them, but their symbolic weight was immense. They were often given as love tokens. A knight might wear a girdle given to him by his lady as a favor in a tournament. And a particularly beautiful or expensive girdle was a sign of wealth and status. Some were intricately embroidered or adorned with jewels and metal plaques. The book Dress and Morality by Aileen Ribeiro details how clothing in the medieval period was a constant broadcast of one's social and moral standing. The girdle was a prime example of this. It communicated a woman's marital status, her wealth, and her virtue to anyone who saw her. The romance of the girdle is in its intimacy and its symbolism of commitment. The act of the groom girding his bride is a gesture of both possession and protection. It is a quiet, physical act that seals the bond between them. Unlike a ring, which adorns a single finger, the girdle encircles the body, a constant reminder of the marital bond. The idea of a husband gifting his new wife a beautifully crafted girdle to wear every day is a romantic one. It was a gift that was both beautiful and functional, a constant, tangible presence in her life. The tradition of the wedding girdle faded as fashion changed. As waistlines on dresses rose and fell, the prominence of the girdle as an outer accessory diminished. It eventually became an undergarment. More importantly, the wedding ring, with its Christian symbolism of eternity and its roots in Roman tradition, grew in popularity and eventually supplanted the girdle as the primary symbol of marriage. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 helped standardize Christian marriage rituals, and the exchange of rings was one of the practices that became more universal. The ring was simpler, more permanent, and less tied to the changing whims of fashion. This makes you wonder about the specifics. Did different colors or materials of girdles have different meanings? Was the loosening of the bride's girdle ever done publicly as part of the ceremony, or was it a private act? And as we wear our simple wedding bands today, have we lost something by trading a symbol that encompassed the whole body for one that sits on a single small finger? Number 12. Why did you marry on the church porch? When you picture a church wedding, you picture it happening inside at the altar. But for much of the Middle Ages, the most important part of the wedding ceremony did not happen inside the church at all. It took place outside at the church door. This part of the ceremony was called usus ad portum ecclesiae, or the rite at the door of the church. This was the legal heart of the wedding. It was here, on the church porch, in full view of the public, that the couple made their vows, exchanged rings, and settled the financial aspects of the marriage, such as the dowry and the dower. This was the civil and legal contract part of the day. It had to be public because, in an era of low literacy and limited record keeping, community witness was the best proof that the marriage had actually happened. Everyone needed to see it and hear it. The church itself was considered a consecrated holy space. The sacrament of marriage was important, but the legal and financial contracts that went with it were seen as worldly matters, best handled just outside the sacred precinct. Only after the legalities were completed at the door would the wedding party move inside the church for the nuptial mass. This mass was a blessing of the union that had already been legally created on the porch. The priest's role at the door was more like that of a legal witness, ensuring the vows were made correctly and with free consent. This practice was formalized by the church itself. The influential 12th century legal text, the Decretum Gratiani, which became the foundation of church law, helped to define marriage as a sacrament requiring consent. However, local customs persisted. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made further attempts to regulate marriage, forbidding clandestine or secret marriages, and emphasizing the need for public announcement, the bans, and a public ceremony. The church porch was the perfect stage for this public act. It was a space that was both public and associated with the authority of the church. The romance of the church door wedding is in its honesty and its public nature. It was a tradition that understood that marriage is both a sacred promise and a social contract. By separating the two parts of the ceremony, it gave each its proper weight. The vows made in the open air for all the world to see have a powerful declarative quality. It was a marriage for the community, not just for the couple and God. It was a promise made not in a quiet, holy whisper, but in a clear voice for every neighbor and passerby to hear. Over time, the entire ceremony moved inside the church. As church authority grew and society became more focused on the sacramental nature of marriage, the distinction between the legal and the sacred parts of the ceremony blurred. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation both brought changes to the liturgy, and eventually, the entire wedding service was consolidated into a single rite performed at the altar. The porch was left behind. This raises some interesting questions about space and ritual. Did the weather ever force a porch ceremony to be moved indoors, and did that affect its perceived legal validity? Were there regional variations, with some cultures insisting on the outdoor portion more strongly than others? And by moving the entire wedding into the sanctuary, have we diminished the importance of the marriage as a public, social contract, focusing almost exclusively on it as a private religious promise? Number 11, was your dowry a price tag or a parachute? The dowry is a tradition that feels deeply unromantic to modern minds. It sounds like the bride's family is paying the groom to take her. But in the medieval context, the dowry was a complex and crucial institution. It was less of a price tag and more of a financial parachute for the bride. A dowry was the property, money, land, livestock, or goods that a bride brought with her into a marriage. This was not a gift to the groom. Legally, the dowry was intended to support the wife during her marriage and to provide for her if she became a widow. The husband had the right to manage the dowry property during the marriage, but he could not sell it without his wife's consent. Upon his death, the dowry property reverted to her full control, separate from her dower rights, her share of his estate. It was her financial safety net. The size of the dowry was a major factor in marriage negotiations. A large dowry could allow a woman to marry up into a higher social class. For families with many daughters, providing dowries for all of them could be a crippling financial burden. This is a recurring theme in medieval literature and history. A woman without a dowry had very poor marriage prospects unless she was exceptionally beautiful or well-connected. She might have to enter a convent or face a life of spinsterhood. The pressure to provide a dowry was immense. Historians like Shulamit Shahar, in her book The Fourth Estate, A History of Women in the Middle Ages, detail the legal intricacies of the dowry system. It varied by region. In Southern Europe, based on Roman law, the dowry system was strong. In Northern Europe, Germanic traditions like the morning gift and bride price of payment from the groom's family to the brides were more prevalent, but the dowry system spread over time. It was a way for a family to ensure their daughter's future well-being in a world where she would have limited opportunities to earn her own living. So where is the romance? It is not a romance of passion, but a romance of parental love and concern. The dowry was a family's ultimate investment in their daughter's future. It was a tangible, lasting expression of their desire to see her safe, secure, and provided for. It was a way of saying, even when you leave our home, we will still be looking after you. For the couple, a substantial dowry provided the economic foundation upon which they could build a stable life and raise a family. A secure start in life, free from immediate financial worry, is a gift that allows love to flourish. The dowry system has mostly disappeared in Western cultures, though it tragically persists in other parts of the world, often in a corrupted and dangerous form. In the West, it declined as women gained more economic rights, the ability to own property independently, and the opportunity to work. The idea of a hope chest or trousseau in the 19th and 20th centuries was a remnant of the dowry tradition, a collection of linens and household goods the bride would bring to the marriage. But the large-scale transfer of wealth became a thing of the past. The forgotten role of the dowry as a protective measure leaves us with questions. How often were the legal protections surrounding a dowry ignored, allowing a husband to squander his wife's property? What happened to a woman's dowry if the marriage was annulled? And in our modern world, where couples often start with significant student debt, have we lost the wisdom of a tradition that aimed to give a new family a solid financial start, free and clear? Number 10, how did everyone know you were getting married? In the age of social media, announcing an engagement is easy. A picture of the ring, a quick post, and everyone you have ever met knows. In the Middle Ages, they had a different system, one that was slower, more formal, and designed to prevent disastrous mistakes. This was the reading of the banns of marriage. The banns were a public announcement of an intended marriage. For 3 consecutive Sundays, or on 3 holy days, the local priest would announce the names of the couple who intended to marry from the pulpit during the main church service. The purpose was simple: to give anyone in the community a chance to object. If anyone knew of a legal or canonical impediment to the marriage, they were morally and legally obligated to come forward. What kind of impediment? There were many. Perhaps one of the parties was already married to someone else. Perhaps they were too closely related. The church had very strict and complex rules about consanguinity, blood relations, and affinity relations by marriage. For example, you could not marry your deceased wife's sister or your godparent's child. Perhaps one of them had taken a vow of celibacy, or perhaps one of them was being forced into the marriage against their will. The bans were a public last-chance safeguard against invalid or illegal marriages. This practice was made mandatory for all of Western Christendom by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 under Pope Innocent III. This was a landmark council that sought to reform and regulate many aspects of church life. Making the bans a universal requirement was a major step in the church's effort to control the institution of marriage and prevent secret, clandestine unions that could lead to bigamy and messy inheritance disputes. Before this, couples could marry by simply exchanging consent, a practice called per verba de praesenti, which led to all sorts of problems. The bans brought the process out into the open. The romance of the bans is the romance of community oversight and protection. It feels bureaucratic, but its intent was deeply caring. It was a system designed to protect the couple and the community from the heartache of an invalid marriage. For the couple, hearing their names announced together in church for 3 weeks was a period of public recognition and anticipation. It was a slow, deliberate, build up to their wedding day. It made their union real and official in the eyes of their neighbors long before they said their vows. It was the community's way of giving its blessing, of saying, we have examined this and we approve. The tradition of reading the bans still exists in some churches, particularly the Church of England and some Catholic parishes, but it is no longer the primary or sole method of publicizing a marriage. We have replaced it with the civil marriage license. We now prove we are free to marry by showing documents to a government clerk, not by subjecting our intentions to the scrutiny of our neighbors. The community has been replaced by the state. This shift from public proclamation to private paperwork raises some important questions. How many weddings were actually stopped by an objection raised during the reading of the bans? What was the social fallout for a couple whose marriage was challenged, even if the objection proved to be false? And in our mobile, anonymous modern world where our neighbors might not even know our last name, have we lost a valuable layer of social protection that the old system, for all its faults, provided? So number 9 was your first toast from a shared cup. The wedding toast, where we raise a glass of champagne to the happy couple, is a staple of modern receptions. Its medieval ancestor was a more intimate and symbolic ritual known as the sops in wine. It involved a shared cup, spiced wine, and a piece of toast, and it was often the final ritual of the wedding day. After the wedding feast, often just before the couple was escorted to the bridal chamber for the bedding ceremony, a cup of wine would be brought forth. The wine was usually hippocras, a popular medieval drink of red wine sweetened with honey and heavily spiced with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and other exotic spices. A piece of toast or a small spiced cake would be dipped into the wine. This soaked bread was the sop. The bride and groom would then share the cup and eat the sop. In some variations, the cup was then passed among the wedding guests. This tradition was rich in symbolism. The shared cup was a universal symbol of unity and a shared life. By drinking from the same vessel, the couple demonstrated that they were now one. The wine, especially spiced wine, was a symbol of celebration, wealth, and vitality. The spices were expensive and thought to have aphrodisiac properties, making it a fitting drink for a wedding night. The sop itself, the piece of bread, represented the staff of life. By sharing it, the couple were expressing their hope for a future filled with sustenance and prosperity. The term toast, in the sense of a celebratory drink, comes directly from this practice. The piece of toasted bread in the bottom of the cup was the toast. Over time, the word came to refer to the drink and the speech that accompanied it, even after the literal piece of bread was no longer used. You can find references to this kind of ceremony in literature of the period. For example, in Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, a character exclaims, "Where's the cook? Is supper ready? The house trimmed, rushes strewed, cobwebs swept, the serving men in their new fustian, their white stockings, and every officer his wedding garment on. Be the jacks fair within, the jills fair without, the carpets laid, and everything in order." This flurry of activity would culminate in these final symbolic rituals like the sops in wine. The romance of the sops in wine lies in its focused intimacy. Amidst the noise and revelry of the wedding feast, this was a moment of quiet connection for the couple. It was a final shared act before they began their private life together. The rich, spiced wine and the shared bread were a multi-sensory experience, a ritual that engaged taste and smell to seal the bond. It was a tradition that was both celebratory and deeply personal. The custom gradually evolved. The communal passing of the cup became less common, perhaps for reasons of hygiene. The practice of dropping a piece of bread in the wine faded away, but the act of drinking a special wine or liquor to celebrate remained. It morphed into the modern wedding toast, which is more about the spoken tribute than the shared physical act. The champagne flute replaced the shared loving cup. Thinking about this lost ritual brings up some questions. What were the specific spice recipes for the hippocras used at a wedding, and did they vary by region or social class? Did the quality of the wine and spices used say something about the family's status? And by shifting the focus from the couple sharing a single cup to guests raising individual glasses, have we transformed a ritual of unity into one of individual acclamation? Number 8, what did throwing wheat at a wedding mean? At many weddings today, guests throw rice or confetti at the couple as they leave the church. This tradition has a direct line back to the Middle Ages and beyond, but they did not throw rice. They threw wheat, and it was one of the most ancient and potent symbols of the entire celebration. Throwing grain, usually wheat kernels, over the bride or the couple was a widespread practice. Wheat was the very essence of life in medieval Europe. It was the primary food source, the basis of the economy, and a powerful symbol of fertility and prosperity. A good harvest meant survival, a bad one meant starvation. By showering the newlyweds with wheat, the community was bestowing its most fervent wish upon them that their union would be as fruitful as a field of wheat, and that they would never know hunger. This tradition has pre-Christian roots, going all the way back to ancient Rome, where guests threw wheat and nuts. The tradition was absorbed and continued throughout the Christian Middle Ages. It was a form of sympathetic magic. By surrounding the couple with the symbols of life and abundance, you were invoking those qualities into their marriage. Each kernel of wheat was a tiny prayer for a child, for a full pantry, for a prosperous future. It was a direct physical act of blessing the couple. The act of throwing wheat is a perfect example of how medieval celebrations were deeply connected to the agricultural calendar and the realities of life. A wedding was not an abstract romantic event. It was about the creation of a new household, a new economic unit that needed to be productive and fertile to survive. Historian Francis Geese, in Marriage and the Family in the Middle Ages, emphasizes the pragmatic nature of medieval unions. The symbolism they used, like wheat, reflected these pragmatic concerns. They wished for love, yes, but they prayed for survival and prosperity. The romance of throwing wheat is earthy and fundamental. It is a love that is rooted in the soil, in the cycle of seasons, in the basic human needs for food, family, and security. It is a tradition that is beautifully straightforward. There is no complex theology behind it, just the simple, powerful hope that the couple's life together will be full and abundant. The image of a community joyfully showering a new couple with the very grain that sustains them is a picture of profound support and hope. In the late 19th century, rice became a popular substitute for wheat in some places, particularly in the United States. It was cheaper and some thought less likely to sprout if left on the ground. Then came the persistent but unfounded urban myth that uncooked rice was harmful to birds, which led to the rise of birdseed, bubbles, and confetti. We have moved further and further away from the original potent symbol. Wheat has been replaced by plastic glitter. This evolution leaves us with some thoughts. Was there a difference between the type of grain thrown at a rich wedding versus a poor one? Did the groom's family or the bride's family supply the wheat for the throwing? And in our modern urbanized world where most of us have no connection to where our food comes from, have we lost the ability to understand and appreciate a powerful natural symbol like a simple grain of wheat? Number 7, why was a chest more important than a dress? A bride's wedding dress is often considered the most important purchase for the big day. But in the medieval period, another item was far more central to her new life, her dowry chest. This piece of furniture was not just for storage, it was a symbol of her identity, her family's wealth, and the foundation of her new home. The dowry chest, also known as a hope chest or a cassone in Italy, was a large, ornate wooden box that a bride brought with her to her husband's home. It was her primary piece of luggage and her most important piece of property. Inside, she would pack her trousseau, her clothes, linens, jewelry, and any other personal or household items she was bringing to the marriage. The chest itself was often a work of art, especially among wealthy families. They were carved, painted, and gilded with scenes from mythology, romance, or the family's coat of arms. It was a public display of her family's status and the value they placed on her. This chest was the cornerstone of the new household's furnishings. In many medieval homes, which were often sparsely furnished, a large chest could serve as a table, a bench, and a secure place to store valuables. It was the bride's personal domain. The contents were part of her dowry, her personal property. The chest physically contained the start of her new life. For years leading up to her marriage, a young woman and her mother would work on filling this chest, weaving linen, embroidering cloths, and gathering the items she would need. The importance of these chests is well documented in art and historical records. Renaissance Florence, for example, was famous for its magnificent cassoni, which are now prized museum pieces. Wills and marriage contracts from the medieval period often list the dowry chest and its contents in great detail, showing its legal and economic significance. As detailed by historians like Margaret F. Rosenthal, who has studied the material culture of Renaissance women, the chest was a physical embodiment of the bride's contribution to the new family unit. The romance of the dowry chest is a romance of hope and preparation. It is a tradition that honors the slow, careful, and loving work that goes into building a home. The years spent filling the chest were years of dreaming and preparing for a future life. It was a project shared between mother and daughter, a passing down of skills and hopes. The chest itself, a solid, tangible object, was a promise of stability and permanence. It was a container for a future. It represented the bride as not just a passive object of exchange, but as an active contributor who brought with her the essential materials to create a home. The tradition of the hope chest lingered for centuries, but has now largely vanished. We have closets, moving vans, and gift registries. The idea of a single piece of furniture embodying a bride's entire contribution to a new home has been replaced by a more diffuse and perhaps less symbolic collection of consumer goods. We no longer have a single beautiful object that tells the story of a bride's journey from her childhood home to her new one. This makes you wonder about the personal stories behind these objects. What did a peasant girl's dowry chest look like compared to a noblewoman's? Were the chests ever used as a bargaining chip in marriage negotiations, with a particularly fine chest sweetening the deal? And in our disposable flat-pack furniture world, have we lost the appreciation for a piece of furniture that was meant to last a lifetime and be passed down through generations, carrying the history of a family within it? Number 6. Could you take a marriage for a test drive? The idea of a trial marriage sounds shockingly modern, but a version of it existed in parts of medieval Europe, particularly in Celtic regions like Scotland and Ireland. It was a pre-Christian custom that survived for centuries, known as handfasting. And in its original form, it sometimes came with a 1-year and a day escape clause. Hand fasting was the traditional Celtic ceremony of betrothal, or marriage. The core of the ritual involved the couple joining hands, and their hands being loosely bound together with a cord or ribbon, symbolizing their union. This is where the phrase tying the knot comes from. In its earliest form, hand fasting was a complete marriage ceremony in itself, a binding contract made between two people in front of their community. The presence of a priest was not required. The most fascinating aspect of this tradition was the temporary hand fasting. In some communities, a couple could agree to a hand fasting for a period of a year and a day. During this time, they would live together as husband and wife. At the end of the period, they could choose. If they were compatible and happy, they could commit to a permanent union. If they were not, they could part ways without any social stigma. Any child born during the trial period was considered legitimate and would be cared for by the father's clan. This practice is documented in the ancient Brehon laws of Ireland, a complex legal system that predated English common law. These laws recognized various forms of marriage, including temporary arrangements. While the Christian Church fought hard to stamp out such customs and replace them with its ideal of a lifelong, indissoluble sacrament, these folk traditions persisted in rural and remote areas for a very long time. The famous hand-fasting fairs, like the one at Escalimir in Scotland, were places where young people could meet and agree to these trial unions as late as the 17th century. The romance of this type of hand fasting is in its radical pragmatism and its respect for individual choice. It is a tradition that acknowledges that compatibility is not guaranteed. It allows a couple to base their lifelong commitment on real-world experience rather than just romantic hope. It is a system that values happiness and suitability, and it provides a compassionate exit strategy if the match is wrong. It is also remarkably fair to women and children for its time, protecting them from the shame of illegitimacy. It is a romance based on honesty, experience, and mutual consent. The Church's view of marriage as a permanent sacrament eventually won out, and temporary hand fasting disappeared, condemned as immoral. The practice of hand fasting itself was either absorbed into the Christian wedding ceremony or survived as a folk custom. In recent decades, it has been revived by neo-pagans and couples looking for a more personal and historical wedding ritual. But the trial period aspect has been almost entirely forgotten. This raises some truly shocking questions. How many couples actually chose to part ways after the year and the day? We have stories of the tradition, but personal records are scarce. Was this system more or less stable for society than the lifelong, often arranged marriages promoted by the Church? And in a modern world with a 50% divorce rate, did these medieval communities know something about building a lasting partnership that we have forgotten? Number 5, could you marry someone without a priest? Today, we think of a wedding as either a religious ceremony or a civil one. Both involve an official, a priest, or a judge who presides over the event. But for a significant part of the Middle Ages, you could get married without any official at all. All you needed was consent. This was the doctrine of the clandestine marriage. According to church law, for a large part of the medieval period, the only thing required to create a valid, binding, and indissoluble marriage was the free exchange of consent between two people who were able to be married. If a man and a woman said to each other, in the present tense, "I take you as my husband, and I take you as my wife," they were married. This was known as marriage per verba de praesenti, by words in the present tense. No priest was needed, no witnesses were required, no ceremony was necessary. The sacrament was conferred by the couple upon each other. This doctrine was a source of endless legal and social chaos. Young couples, especially the children of wealthy nobles whose parents wanted to arrange strategic marriages for them, could secretly marry for love, thwarting their family's plans. A person could make a promise of marriage to multiple people, leading to complicated court cases to determine who was the real spouse. Without witnesses, it often came down to one person's word against another's. The church courts were clogged with these cases. The great theologian Peter Lombard in the 12th century helped to solidify this consent-based doctrine in his sentences, which became a standard theological textbook. He argued powerfully that consent, not consummation or a public ceremony, was the true maker of a marriage. The church's position was that it was better to uphold the sacramental power of the couple's consent, even in secret, than to deny a valid marriage. However, the church strongly discouraged these clandestine marriages, urging couples to marry publicly with the banns and a priest. But it did not, for a long time, invalidate them. The romance of the clandestine marriage is the romance of love against the world. It is the ultimate expression of the idea that love and commitment are a private matter between two people, and that their freely given word to each other is the most powerful bond there is. It is the story of Romeo and Juliet, who were married in secret by Friar Lawrence. It is a tradition that places the power of marriage squarely in the hands of the couple themselves, not in the hands of family, state, or even the church. The chaos caused by clandestine marriages eventually became too much. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, finally decreed that for a marriage to be valid, it must be performed by a priest in the presence of at least two witnesses. This brought an end to the era of the valid secret marriage in the Catholic world. Protestant countries developed their own similar laws requiring public ceremonies. The power to marry was taken from the couple and placed in the hands of official institutions. This dramatic legal shift leaves some huge questions. What percentage of medieval marriages were actually clandestine? It is almost impossible to know, as only the ones that caused problems ended up in court records. Did this system empower women by allowing them to choose their own partners? Or did it make them more vulnerable to seducers who would promise marriage in private and then deny it? And in our modern, highly regulated world, what have we lost by denying that the simple private promise between two people is a powerful and sacred thing in itself? Number 4, why was a sword part of the wedding? When we think of wedding accessories, we think of rings, flowers, and veils. We do not usually think of a sword, but in many medieval cultures, especially those with a strong warrior tradition like the Norse and Germanic peoples, the exchange of swords was a central part of the wedding ceremony. This tradition was deeply symbolic. The groom would offer his sword to the bride's father or guardian. The father would then give this sword, or sometimes the family's ancestral sword, back to the groom. This act symbolized the transfer of responsibility for the bride's protection. The father was entrusting his daughter's safety to her new husband. The groom, by accepting the sword, was making a solemn public vow to defend her and their new family with his life. In some traditions, the bride would then present the sword to her husband, who would pledge his loyalty on it. Later in the ceremony, the groom might use the sword to make the sign of the cross over the marital bed to bless it and ward off evil spirits. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of power, authority, family honor, and the protective duties of a husband. In Norse sagas, the sword of the ancestors is a recurring motif, a powerful symbol of lineage and heritage. For a groom to receive this sword was to be fully accepted into his wife's family and entrusted with its future. This custom is a reminder that medieval life could be dangerous. Protection was not an abstract concept. It was a daily necessity. As detailed in books like The Vikings of History by Robert Ferguson, a man's ability to wield a sword was directly linked to his ability to protect his household from raids, outlaws, and feuds. The wedding sword exchange was a deadly serious promise. It was the physical embodiment of the vow to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, and to protect against all threats. The romance of the sword exchange is a fierce and powerful one. It is a romance of trust, duty, and protection. It is a husband's promise not just to love his wife, but to be her shield. It is a father's ultimate act of trust in his new son-in-law. It is a tradition that takes the abstract promise of care and makes it tangible, sharp, and heavy. It acknowledges the dangers of the world and a couple's need to face them together, with the husband as the sworn protector. As societies became more peaceful and centralized, and as the carrying of swords became less common in daily life, this tradition faded away. The church's marriage ceremony, which focused on rings and prayers, also had no place for a pagan-inflected ritual involving a weapon. The sword was replaced by the ring as the primary symbol of the wedding vow. The promise of protection became a spoken word, no longer embodied in a piece of steel. This forgotten ritual makes us ponder the nature of marital vows. How did the weight of a physical sword in his hand affect a groom's understanding of his vows? Were there cases where a family refused to hand over the ancestral sword because they did not trust the groom? And in our modern world, where the threats are often emotional or financial rather than physical, what would be the equivalent symbol of a vow to protect one's partner from all harm? Number 3 was your wedding color blue, not white. The image of a bride in a pristine white dress is so ingrained in our culture that it feels timeless. But it is a surprisingly recent tradition. For most of the Middle Ages and for centuries after, brides did not wear white. They simply wore their best dress, whatever color it happened to be, and one of the most popular and symbolic colors for a bride was blue. A medieval bride from a wealthy family would wear a dress made of rich, expensive fabrics like velvet, silk, or damask, often trimmed with fur. The colors would be bold and vibrant deep reds, greens, and golds crash on to show off the family's wealth. And a bride from a poorer family would wear a new dress of sturdy wool or linen, but again, in a practical color. White was an impractical color. It was difficult to make, expensive to buy, and nearly impossible to keep clean in the muddy, smoky world of medieval Europe. A white dress was a luxury few could afford, and it was not specifically associated with weddings. Blue, however, was a color rich with positive symbolism. In Christian art, the Virgin Mary was almost always depicted wearing blue. The color therefore became associated with her qualities, purity, faithfulness, and modesty. A bride wearing blue was subtly aligning herself with the holiest of women, making a public statement about her virtue and her intention to be a faithful wife. The old rhyming proverb, "Marry in blue, lover be true," reflects this long-standing association. The tradition of the white wedding dress was popularized much, much later. It was Queen Victoria who set the trend when she chose to wear a white lace gown for her wedding to Prince Albert in 1840. She was not the first royal to wear white, but her wedding was highly publicized, and images of her dress were widely distributed. Society women in Europe and America quickly began to copy the fashionable young queen, and the white wedding dress became the new standard, its meaning reinterpreted to be the ultimate symbol of purity and innocence. The romance of the blue wedding dress is in its quiet confidence and its deep historical symbolism. It is a tradition that values faithfulness over virginal purity, a subtle but important distinction. Blue is the color of the sky, and the sea, a color of depth and stability. A bride in blue was a bride promising to be a true and constant partner. It is a choice that feels more grounded, less theatrical than the stark white dress that came to replace it. It is a promise of loyalty, a quality essential for a lifelong partnership. The triumph of the white dress means we have forgotten the rich color symbolism that once surrounded weddings. We have narrowed our focus to a single color, losing the variety and personal expression that came with choosing a gown of deep blue, rich red, or earthy green. It has also made the wedding dress a single-use garment, a strange and expensive modern invention. A medieval bride would wear her best dress again on other special occasions. This forgotten color palette leads to some interesting questions. Did the specific shade of blue matter? For example, was a pale blue seen as more virtuous than a deep indigo? How did the rise of the white dress in the 19th century connect with Victorian ideas about female sexuality and innocence? And as modern brides begin to experiment with colored wedding dresses again, are they aware that they are not starting a new trend, but rather reconnecting with a much older and more diverse tradition? Number 2, were wedding rings worn on the right hand? The wedding ring on the third finger of the left hand is a symbol so universal we barely think about it. The vena moris, the mythical vein of love running from that finger directly to the heart, is a story we all know. But this tradition was not universal in the Middle Ages. For many people, the wedding ring was worn on the right hand. The practice of exchanging rings is ancient, dating back to the Romans, but the specific finger and hand have varied significantly across time and cultures. In many parts of medieval Europe, including in Germany, Poland, and Spain, the custom was to place the wedding ring on the bride's right hand. This practice was often rooted in early Christian traditions. The right hand was considered the hand of honor, strength, and authority. It was the hand used for making oaths and signing contracts. Placing the wedding ring on the right hand symbolized the sacred and binding nature of the marriage oath. It was a contract sealed in the sight of God. The shift to the left hand in some other traditions, like in England, is often linked to the Roman vena amoris idea, which was revived during the Renaissance. But there was also a more practical reason. The left hand is generally the non-dominant hand. Wearing a valuable ring on that hand kept it safer from damage during daily work. Over time, the English and French custom of the left hand became more and more dominant, especially in the English-speaking world. But the right-hand tradition never completely disappeared. To this day, in many European countries, including Germany, Russia, and India, the wedding ring is still worn on the right hand. The theological and symbolic debates over which hand was correct are fascinating. Some early church fathers argued for the right hand because it was the hand with which one made the sign of the cross. Others favored the left. The Sarum rite, a form of liturgy used in medieval England, had a fascinating ritual. The groom would first place the ring on the bride's thumb, saying, "In the name of the Father," then on the index finger, and of the Son, then the middle finger, and of the Holy Spirit, and finally on the third finger, saying, "Amen," where the ring would remain. This ritual shows how much thought and symbolism went into an act we now perform without a second thought. The romance of the right-hand ring is a romance of strength and honor. It is a tradition that frames the wedding vow not just as a matter of the heart, the left hand, but as a solemn oath, a public pledge made with one's hand of power and action. It elevates the marriage promise to the level of the most sacred and binding contracts a person could make. It is a symbol of a love that is not just felt, but actively and honorably lived out in the world. The dominance of the left-hand tradition means that many people in the Anglo-American world are completely unaware that there is any other way. We have accepted one regional custom as a universal rule. We have forgotten that for centuries, a vast number of people symbolized their marriage with the opposite hand. This raises some final curious questions about a tradition we thought we knew so well. How did the split between right-hand and left-hand traditions originally develop? Was it a theological dispute, a regional custom, or just an accident of history? Did people in the Middle Ages ever switch their ring from one hand to another for practical reasons? And did that change its meaning? And does the hand we use ultimately matter, or is the true meaning simply, in the unbroken circle of the ring itself, a symbol of eternity no matter where it is worn? Number one, why was tying a knot the real wedding? Of all the forgotten medieval wedding traditions, none is as romantic, as fundamental, and as influential as hand fasting. It is the origin of the phrase tying the knot, and for many people in pre-Christian and early medieval Europe, it was not just a part of the wedding. It was the wedding. Hand fasting, in its simplest form, is the act of a couple joining hands and having them bound together with a cord or ribbon as they declare their intention to be married. This act was the physical and visible seal of their union. It was a powerful, intuitive symbol. Two separate hands, two separate lives, bound together as one. The knot was not a permanent shackle, it was a symbol of a bond that was willingly entered into. Often, at the end of the ceremony, the couple could slip their hands out of the knot without untying it, symbolizing that they were forever bound by the vow, yet free within the union. This was a folk tradition, not a church one. It has deep roots in Celtic and Norse culture, long before the arrival of Christianity. It was a marriage made by the community for the community. The ceremony would often take place outdoors, in nature, at a sacred spot like under a large tree or near a stone circle. A respected elder or community leader might preside, but the real power of the ceremony came from the couple's own words and the witness of their family and friends. The binding of the hands was the legal and spiritual climax of the event. As Christianity spread, the church worked to absorb or suppress these older folk traditions. Hand fasting was one that it could not entirely eliminate. In many places, it was incorporated into the Christian ceremony. The priest might wrap his stole around the couple's joined hands as a symbol of the church's blessing on the union. But the core idea that the binding of hands was the moment of union persisted. The church emphasized that consent was the true maker of marriage, but for ordinary people, the visual, tangible act of hand fasting often felt like the real wedding. The historian John R. Gillis, in his book For Better for Worse British Marriages, 1600 to the present, argues that for centuries, two parallel marriage systems existed: the official church system and the informal, community-based system of which hand fasting was a part. For many people, a hand fasting was a valid betrothal, a true marriage in the eyes of their neighbors, even if it lacked the church's official stamp. The romance of hand fasting is profound. It is a tradition that is simple, personal, and deeply meaningful. It requires no expensive rings, no elaborate church, no official license. It requires only the couple, a piece of cord, and their promise to each other. It is a tradition that places the power of the marriage in the hands of the couple themselves. The physical act of being bound together, of feeling the knot tied around your joined hands, is an incredibly powerful emotional experience. It is a tradition that is both ancient and timeless, a pure and simple expression of unity. Today, hand fasting is experiencing a major revival. Couples of all faiths and of no faith are incorporating it into their wedding ceremonies. They are drawn to its history, its simplicity, and its powerful symbolism. It has become a way to make a wedding feel more personal, more authentic, and more connected to a deep, ancestral past. It is the ultimate forgotten tradition, brought back to life because its meaning is so universal. But even with its revival, there are things we still do not know. How much did the color of the hand-fasting cords matter to medieval people? We know they used different colors, but was there a complex symbolic language we have lost? When a couple performed a hand-fasting without a priest, how did they record it to prove it to future generations? And as we re-embrace this beautiful ancient ritual, are we capturing its true binding meaning, or have we turned a solemn contract into just another pretty photo opportunity? The knot is tied, but its deepest secrets may still be held in the past.